I wasn't searching for giants when this investigation began. Architectural anomalies were what I was after. Doorways built too tall, staircases too grand, furniture scaled beyond what humans would need, the sort of historical curiosities you'd typically note down as decorative excess or ceremonial design, and then move along from. But then came the photographs. Not paintings, not myths, not folklore worn smooth by generations of retelling. Photographs. Actual photographic evidence from the mid to late 1800s showing human beings of impossible scale, standing alongside people of regular size. Their proportions so dramatic they looked like composites, except they weren't composites. The grading matched. The lighting matched. The shadows landed exactly where they should. These images were made before the technology existed to fake them convincingly. And that's the moment the official explanations began falling apart. The further in I went, the more photographs surfaced. Cartes de visit from the 1860s, cabinet cards from the 1870s, tintype images showing men, and occasionally women, standing 8, sometimes 10 feet tall. Not circus performers with advertised billing, not showmen with documented names and map-traveling routes. Just people. Individuals photographed in formal settings, dressed in period, appropriate clothing, sometimes surrounded by family members of entirely normal height. The British Museum archives hold several. The Smithsonian references them in passing, then brushes them aside as medical anomalies without any further inquiry. French collections contain similar images, catalogued and quietly filed away. Russian imperial records reference persons of unusual stature serving in ceremonial roles. Always the same pattern. Acknowledge, categorize, move on, never investigate. Never ask why. Why were there so many? Why do the photographs cluster in specific decades, concentrated primarily between 1850 and 1900, then vanish without explanation? Why do accounts from that era describe these individuals not as freaks or oddities, but as ordinary members of society? People holding positions of authority, working as guards, overseers, foremen on construction projects. And here is where things become genuinely strange. A great many of these photographs show the giants standing in front of buildings. Massive buildings. Buildings with doorways that seem absurdly oversized for normal human beings, but fall into perfect proportion when placed against individuals standing 9 feet tall. Buildings we have been told were designed for grandeur or intimidation. Buildings that suddenly make complete sense the moment you put a 9-foot human being into the frame. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I began measuring doorways in government buildings from the 1700s and 1800s, 12 to 15 feet high. Not at the entrance inside, in working corridors where grandeur serves absolutely no purpose. Staircases with risers so tall that a person of normal height must stretch uncomfortably just to climb them. Furniture found in estate sales and museum storage, desks, chairs, beds, all running slightly too large. All dismissed as decorative or custom, made for unusually tall individuals. But this isn't confined to one building. It is thousands. Courthouses across America, administrative buildings throughout Europe, government complexes in Russia, India, South America, all constructed within the same period, all sharing the same oversized proportions, all supposedly designed this way for aesthetic reasons. Despite the obvious impracticality, despite the added cost, despite the fact that none of it makes functional sense, unless the people occupying these spaces weren't average-sized. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In St. Petersburg, administrative buildings from the 1700s have 12-foot doors in back hallways. In Buenos Aires, municipal structures feature staircases requiring enormous strides to ascend. In Delhi, colonial-era government buildings supposedly constructed by and for British administrators contain furniture at scales that would make a 6-foot man feel like a child. These weren't ceremonial spaces. These were working buildings, offices, administrative centers, the everyday architecture of governance and oversight. Who were they built for? And that is where Tartaria becomes impossible to set aside. If you're unfamiliar, Tartaria appears on maps from the 1700s and early 1800s as a vast territory stretching across northern Asia. Not a legend, not a myth, an actual labeled region appearing in encyclopedias, atlases, and historical records with the same casual certainty as France or Spain. Then, sometime in the mid-1800s, it disappears. Not conquered, not renamed, erased. The maps are redrawn. The encyclopedias omit it. The history books proceed as though it never existed. But the architecture remains. Massive stone structures across Central Asia, Russia, Mongolia. Buildings of impossible scale and precision. Doorways sized for giants. Halls that echo with vastness. All supposedly erected by various empires or local craftsmen, with no documentation, no verified construction records, no explanation for how such engineering was achieved with the technology supposedly available at the time. What if the giants weren't anomalies? What if they constituted a specialized class? Guardians, overseers, administrators of infrastructure and construction. What if their size was functional rather than ceremonial? What if buildings were scaled to accommodate them because they were the ones overseeing construction and maintaining these structures? It would explain the architectural patterns. Why government buildings, courthouses, administrative centers, structures of oversight and control carry oversized proportions while residential areas remain human-scaled? Why the photographs consistently show giants in formal, official contexts rather than domestic ones? Why historical records place them in supervisory and authoritative roles, but rarely as merchants, artists, or common laborers? It would also explain the construction mystery. How were massive stone structures built with such precision in the 1700s and 1800s? Perhaps they weren't built by the civilizations we credit them to. Perhaps they were built for those civilizations by a preceding society, one that employed individuals physically capable of moving stones, operating machinery, and managing construction at scales we consider impossible. And it would explain the systematic erasure. If you are inheriting structures you did not build, inheriting technology you do not fully understand, inheriting architectural systems designed for a different kind of human being, what do? You adapt the narrative. You claim it as your own. You rewrite the construction dates, backdate the architects, and quietly remove any evidence suggesting someone else was here first. Ask yourself how many mysterious construction techniques suddenly become comprehensible if you assume the builders were physically larger and stronger than modern humans. How many supposedly impossible engineering feats become merely difficult when the laborers stood 9 feet tall? The photographic record is not the only evidence. Throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s, newspapers across America regularly published accounts of giant human skeletons being discovered. Not scattered anomalies, but systematic findings. The New York Times, 1885. A 7-foot skeleton uncovered in a Michigan mound. The San Diego Union, 1895. Bones of extraordinary size found during railroad excavation. The Middletown Signal, 1899. Giant human remains brought to light in Ohio. These were not tabloid sensations. These were mainstream newspapers reporting what was, at the time, considered newsworthy, but not particularly controversial. The accounts describe skeletons measuring 7 to 12 feet in length, frequently found in organized burial sites, often accompanied by artifacts pointing toward advanced metallurgy and construction knowledge. Then something shifted. After roughly 1920, these reports cease, not gradually, abruptly. Discoveries that had once made front pages simply stopped appearing. The skeletons already recovered, many of them sent to the Smithsonian Institution for further study. The Smithsonian now claims no such skeletons exist within their collections. Missing, lost, misplaced during routine transfers. Hundreds of specimens, all gone without proper documentation. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss. Discoveries peak in the late 1800s. The same period the giant photographs surface. The same period Tartaria disappears from maps. Then everything stops simultaneously. The photographs stop. The newspaper reports stop. The maps are redrawn. The encyclopedias rewrite themselves, as though someone collectively decided certain questions were no longer acceptable to raise. Why would anyone bury evidence of human biological diversity? Why would physical proof challenging the standard account of human history be systematically removed? Unless that proof implied something larger, something organized, something pointing toward a different structure of recent civilization than the one we have been taught. Consider something that sounds absurd until the evidence accumulates. What if the giants weren't rulers? What if they were a specialized class? Guardians, overseers, administrators of infrastructure and construction. What if their size served a function rather than a ceremony? What if buildings were proportioned to them because they were the ones overseeing their construction and day-to-day maintenance? It would explain why government buildings, courthouses, and administrative centers carry oversized proportions while residential areas remain human-scaled. Why the photographs showed giants consistently in formal, official settings rather than domestic ones. Why historical records position them in supervision and authority, but rarely as merchants, artists, or ordinary laborers. What disturbs me most is not the evidence itself. It is the coordinated silence that surrounds it. Academic institutions do not debate the giant skeletons. They behave as though they never existed. Museums do not display the photographs. They file them in archives marked miscellaneous or unverified. Historical societies do not examine the architectural proportions. They attribute them to artistic choice. The pattern holds across disciplines, across countries, across centuries of scholarship. This is not active suppression. It is passive erasure. Questions simply not asked. Evidence not examined. Connections not drawn, because drawing them leads somewhere the established narrative cannot accommodate. And when you raise it, when you lay the evidence out side by side, the photographs, the architecture, the newspaper reports, the missing records, you receive the same response. Interesting, but not significant. As though coincidence accounts for everything. As though patterns carry no meaning. As though asking why is somehow inappropriate. But the why is the entire point. Why did humans of extraordinary size exist in sufficient numbers to be regularly photographed and regularly discovered in burial sites? Why were they documented and then forgotten? Why does architecture from a specific era accommodate their proportions? Why do these elements cluster in the same geographical regions and the same time periods as Tartaria's disappearance from cartographic record? And why, the moment you raise any of this in academic circles, does the conversation immediately close? I keep returning to the photographs. These were not monsters. They were not myths. They were people. Individuals with faces and clothing and families. People who stood for formal portraits the same way anyone else did in the 1800s. People whose existence was so unremarkable at the time that photographers felt no need to explain or contextualize their presence. We have made them remarkable by erasing them. We have made them impossible by refusing to accept that they were ever possible. We have converted documented reality into forbidden speculation. And in doing so, we have lost something. Not merely knowledge of who they were, but understanding of what we are, what we have forgotten, what we have inherited without comprehension. The massive doorways remain. The oversized staircases still stand. The buildings that make no sense at human scale continue serving modern functions, their original purpose obscured beneath centuries of adaptive reuse. We pass through them daily without pausing to ask why. We accept the official explanations without examining whether those explanations actually explain anything. Because examining them means accepting that history is not a straight line of progress. That we may be living inside the remnants of something more sophisticated. Something we did not build, something we do not fully understand. That the giants in the photographs were not aberrations but evidence of a different arrangement entirely. A different society. A different world. I began stumbling across enormously sized chairs in estate auctions and the forgotten storage rooms of museums. Chairs that make no anatomical sense, not thrones. Not ceremonial pieces designed to intimidate or impress. Ordinary chairs. Dining chairs, desk chairs, sitting chairs built for daily use. Except the scale is wrong. Seat height measuring 30 to 36 inches from the floor, nearly double the standard 18-inch height that accommodates normal human leg length. Backrests towering 7, sometimes 8 feet high. Armrests positioned at a height that would leave an average person's arms hanging uselessly at their sides. Auction catalogs list them as decorative furniture or display pieces, as though people in the 1800s routinely commissioned chairs they could not physically use simply for aesthetic purposes. Museum curators label them oversized Victorian design without explaining why such designs keep appearing in government buildings, administrative offices, and courthouse waiting rooms. Functional spaces where comfort and usability would presumably matter considerably. And then there are the instruments themselves. The artifacts no one wants to properly classify. Massive wrenches found in demolition sites across Europe and North America. Tools measuring 4, 5, sometimes 6 feet in length. Not decorative. Not ceremonial. Functional tools bearing wear patterns. The kind of grip erosion that accumulates only through actual sustained use. Tools shaped for hands considerably larger than ours. Museums categorize them as industrial equipment, without explaining what industrial process would require a wrench weighing 200 pounds, one that demands the grip strength of 3 normal men to operate. Auction houses sell them off as antique curiosities without asking why they were manufactured in sufficient quantities, that they keep resurfacing in estate sales. Barn cleanouts and building demolitions more than a century after they were made, and suddenly the oversized tools and the outsized furniture are no longer anomalies. They are confirmation. So who were these giant people? Were they the guardians of Tartaria? The administrative class of a civilization we have been instructed never existed. The overseers of construction projects whose scale and precision we still cannot replicate with modern technology. I do not have definitive answers. Only questions that accumulate, that stack upon one another, that build a weight the official narrative cannot support. Why does the photographic evidence cluster in the exact decades when Tartaria vanishes from maps? Why do architectural proportions correspond to the scale of individuals in those photographs? Why do newspaper accounts of giant skeleton discoveries cease at precisely the moment when references to advanced pre-industrial technology begin disappearing from historical records? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies that happen to align. Pattern. And when you see the pattern, when you trace it across continents and centuries, when you watch it emerge and then vanish with suspicious precision, you are left with one unavoidable question. What aren't we being told? What did we inherit that we have chosen to forget? What knowledge was lost or concealed when the maps were redrawn and the giants were written out of history? The buildings remember, even when we do not. The photographs preserve what the encyclopedias erased. The evidence persists, waiting for someone willing to ask the questions everyone else has quietly agreed not to raise. Who were the giants? Why did they disappear? And what else vanished alongside them that we are still pretending was never here? And what else vanished alongside them that we are still pretending was never here at all? I don't have answers that would satisfy an academic. I don't have a unified theory that ties every thread into a clean conclusion. What I have is the accumulating weight of things that shouldn't exist, photographed by people who saw nothing unusual about photographing them, built by hands we cannot account for, stored in institutions that quietly stopped talking about them, and buried in archives no one is encouraged to open. The official history asks you to accept a series of coincidences, that the photographs are medical curiosities, that the architecture is aesthetic preference, that the newspaper reports were exaggeration, that the skeletons were mislabeled and then misplaced, that Tartaria was simply a vague geographic term that naturally faded from usage, that none of these things are connected because connecting them leads somewhere uncomfortable. But coincidences don't cluster this precisely. Anomalies don't vanish this cleanly. Evidence doesn't disappear from this many institutions simultaneously, unless disappearing was the point. We are living in structures we didn't design, walking through doorways built for people we've been told never existed, inheriting a world whose original occupants have been methodically removed from the record. And the strangest part isn't that it happened. The strangest part is how completely we stopped asking about it. The giants in the photographs aren't asking to be believed. They're simply standing there, the way they always were, waiting for someone to finally look directly at them and refuse to look away.